All right, welcome to the Grow Food Homestead podcast, where we discuss everything related to growing your own food, homesteading, self resilience, and really a broad range of topics. So today we are going to focus mainly on agroforestry, and the guest is Harry Greene. He is the co-founder and CRO of Propagate. So Harry, man, thank you for joining us today. How's it going?
Andres, thanks for having me on. Things are good. I'm in Trumansburg, New York right now on my farm in my barn actually, and it's sunny and about 20 degrees Fahrenheit.
It's pretty cold, man. Over here in South Florida, it's like pretty perfect weather right now. It's in like 70, low 70s, sunny. So it's neither hot nor cold, right? So this is like the perfect time of the year really over
Yeah,
here.
if I could teleport there, go there for the weekend. That sounds great. But no, I'm content. I just got a new wood stove, and I'm very psyched about it. So turning biomass into heat is something that I've wanted to do for a long time, and it syncs with agroforestry. So beyond just food, uh, yeah, firewood is
Okay,
great.
that is awesome. I love wood stove. I have one myself, but I could barely use it because it gets too hot. Anywhere that you use
And
it,
you
if
don't need
it's
it.
exactly. But I mean, it's still fun to use them. But hey, man, let's jump right into it. And I just was hoping that you could share a little bit of your background, how you got into agroforestry, and if you could share a little bit about, Propagate.
Of course. I'll jump into Propagate first and then try and land on how we got here. What Propagate does is we plant trees on farms simply, and there are three things we do within that. The first thing is analytics and financials, so kind of the accounting and economics behind agroforestry. And we have software that lets you draw lines on a map and kind of change your tree species, change your spacing, change how you're going to manage all those trees. And then it gives you 30-year financials. So whether you're planning a farm for production of tree crops or simply wanting to know how much um, ecologically oriented trees or homestead trees are going to cost, that lets you understand the economics, the cash outlays, the revenues, the yields, the labor assumptions, how many hours you're going to need to manage tree crops. The second thing we do is work as a contractor for planting trees on farms. So that can be for anything from fruiting shrubs like black currants and elderberries through to black locust for fence posts and rot resistant timber, into chestnuts, and then into trees for ecosystem services. So our clients are usually farms that want trees for any variety of reasons, and then entities like NGOs that are interested in water quality, flood mitigation, biodiversity, folks that are interested in carbon, so carbon sequestration, whether that's offsets or insetting. And then the last thing we do, the third thing, is we actually raise money and deploy trees as assets onto farmland. So we lease the land but own the trees. It's similar to leasing land for a solar array, but we're using the original biological solar panels instead of the photovoltaic ones.
That's awesome, man. It's definitely a good system you got going, especially with the analytics and really understanding how to make a farm be productive and, of course, optimize all the different systems within a biological system, which is a farm, right? I really very interested in that. And then I saw on your website that it's important for you to put in the right trees in the right places for the right reasons, right? So can you elaborate a little bit why that's important?
Yeah, of course. You had also asked how we got started with Propagate. And so then I'll dive into right trees in the right place for the right reasons. So my two co-founders and I, Ethan Steinberg and Jeremy Kaufman, we were all interested in healthy food coming from vibrant landscapes in a way that fit with the kind of, I mean, not necessarily the large scale industrial agricultural model, but in a way that could scale up, scale down, and replicate. And all being from the cold, forested climate of the northern US, it made sense to focus in our own backyard first. So trees really seemed like that intervention point. I got turned on to agroforestry during college. I actually studied business and Spanish. I majored in, but then I guess probably my third or fourth year, forestry and agriculture really arose as the passion point and where I wanted to focus my career. But so right trees in right place, for right reasons. Say so there are a few things we can jump into here. First is how much time you want to spend managing trees. And you could mean you as a person running a homestead. It could be you running a small farm. It could be you as a company. It could be you as a nonprofit, you as a community, collective, any group of people, any individual. You have to understand how much time, energy, resources you want to put into planting and managing trees. Because a lot of the interest in trees comes from an interest in ecology, and that's kind of derived from it's almost like a personality trait, agreeableness aspect, compassion. Like you see a lot of people interested in agroforestry that just have a broad interest in ecology. So if you have that, you then have to ask yourself, like, with the people I'm working with, how much time and money do I want to put into this system? Um, because matching your resource base with what you're managing day to day is super important. Um, so different tree species will align differently with different contexts, different holistic contexts. Um, Different crops necessitate work during certain periods of the year. So, do you want to be adding hours to your plate in winter or in summer? What do you want to be selling? Who do you want to be selling to? Because, say, between black locust and elderberry, with the first one, you're selling fence posts and you're probably harvesting them in the dormant season. And with the second one, you're selling cough syrup and you are harvesting and processing it in the summer. You might be selling it all year round, but it's going to add a lot of hours to your plate in a totally different season, and you're doing a totally different thing. So people that are passionate about berries and people that are passionate about wood or nuts or any other type of fruit are often different. So like understanding yourself and your business and your goals is fundamental before you just go plant a bunch of trees.
Definitely makes a lot of sense because depending on where you are and why you want to do your food growing journey or projects, then it's going to look very different from person to person, or how you mentioned, from homestead to homestead or farm to farm, even organization if it's a NGO, or even a community as a whole, right? Depending on the climate or what food they want to produce. And I think that's where planning ahead is so key. Doing a proper design prior to making many big changes in a property is why it's so key. But then, how do you choose the crops based on suitability, economic, and environmental factors?
Yep. Yep. So you have to look at not just what you want, but what your land can support. So you look at soil drainage, soil pH, precipitation, how much humidity you have, how much irrigation you're going to need, um, how much energy you're going to need to pour into a crop to make it successful. So apples are something plant in the Northeast US, and it's really easy to grow apples in, say, Washington, because they're native to Kazakhstan, and the climate analog between the dry mountains of Kazakhstan and the drier mountains of, say, Washington or Oregon is a lot more similar than, say, Kazakhstan to New York, or Kazakhstan to, say, northern Japan, which, say, northern Japan, the far east of Russia or Korea over there, northern China even, is really the only other climate analog we have in the Northeast US. So you're looking at your soil, you're looking at your climate, and you're looking at your holistic context. And you can spend a good amount of time learning about which soil types go well with which crops. It's often easy to benchmark off of what other people are doing. So if, say, you were in our app, it's called Overyield, you can pull up suitability maps. So that's going to give you a heat map of your farm or your 1 acre. It's going to look at the depth to water table of the soil, flooding frequency, soil porosity, that's based on the surface soil texture. So whether it's clay, silt, sand, loam, and what else? pH, so the acidity. Big example here. Blueberries need acidic soil and drainage, and versus, say, black currants are okay with a higher pH soil, and they're okay with soil that's less well drained. Chestnuts also need drainage. So if you have a high water table or heavy soil, then you might want to look at a different crop. And you really want to sync the crop that's best suited for your location with the crop that's best suited for your lifestyle or your business. So if you want to be more hands off, then, say, timber trees might be for you. You just want to plant trees and kind of leave them alone and prune them in the winter. Versus if you want very hands-on management, you can dive into a small food forest and make your yard a really awesome place to hang out and be gardening all the time. It's really important to distinguish between, like, large scale agriculture and gardening, because gardening is replicable, and then large scale mechanized agricultural is more scalable.
You touched on with a lot of good points there, so I appreciate that. And what comes to mind is being able to have the balance between what you could grow in your property, what grows well, right? And then, but if you also want to do it for profit, how to still manage to have biodiversity. I think what comes to mind, for example, if I want to grow down here a lot of papayas, right? They grow very easily, they grow quickly, you get a lot of production. That could be a good stream of income. Or let's say moringa, it also grows very well down here, and it has a lot of demand in the market, right? So, but then if you just plant that everywhere, then how do you manage diversity and in your property?
Yep. Yeah. So something we stumble upon here is people equating straight lines of trees with monoculture or with a non-diverse system. And it's really important to differentiate between something that's mechanized and something that's diverse, and they can be the same thing. So you can have straight lines, um, and you can have within that row of trees different species. So versus if you want to have curved lines and stuff on contour where the rows of trees are not equidistant from one another, or it's kind of like a multi-strata, um, hand harvested, say, coffee or cacao agroforestry system. Um, Yeah, it's so you can the point here is that you can work in diversity to a system that's also efficient, super efficient to manage. One of the ways that we'll do that is, say, every 10 rows, this is in a larger scale industrial system, putting a row or two of super diverse trees for biodiversity that are at the same spacing and are going to roughly be the same size as the chestnuts. So we just pick a bunch of native hardwoods, probably some softwoods as well, and yeah, work those in every N rows. So you have that insect and bird and fungal biodiversity that comes with plant diversity, and you have production at the same time. You can do that same thing with shrubs. So, say within elderberries or black currants, you can work in, um, say, something that would even work with a mechanical harvester. Like you can put in red osier dogwood or speckled alder or false indigo or any of these shrubs that the insects love. You can work that into your system. So you can really increase diversity while keeping management simple.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's exactly what I meant with my question, and I definitely painted a picture. So appreciate that answer. And when you mentioned depending on the size, right? If it's a large scale to a homestead, it made me think of it's a concept that I heard recently, which is a principle is a microcosm of all principles. So based on what you mentioned, that obviously if it's a large scale farm, the rows will be different and the spacing would be different. But what principles do you think apply both in a large scale and if it's, let's say, an 1 acre to 2 acre homestead?
That's a good question. I think you want to make things convenient and easy to manage. So there are, I'll give an example of something outside of agriculture and then weave it back into agriculture. So there's a book called Holistic Management. And the example that the author, Alan Savory, gives is that there was a boarding school and there was a tennis championship every year. And the section of students that won the tennis championship every year was the house that was closest to the tennis court because it was most convenient for them to play more tennis and do the thing that they needed to do more often. So if you want to think about zones of use, zones 0, 1 through 5, or facets of a larger farm that you need to be managing more often, such as irrigation, then you want to make those things convenient for you. And you can look at certain tasks that you have to do all the time and put that infrastructure in a place. This is pretty obvious, but you walk around farms and sometimes it's uh, farms or homesteads, and the thing that someone manages is super far away from where they're spending most of their time. And you don't want to put like ugly industrial things next to where you're spending most of your time on a homestead necessarily, but it's threading the needle between probably like quality of life, even in a business or a larger farm, and efficiency of where you put all your equipment.
That's a great way to put it at the end, right? Between the efficiency and, well, actually, I missed it already, but it just sounded great. So if you could repeat that one more
Yeah.
time, the last part.
I forget what I said, but like
I'll go
basically
back to it.
my irrigation controls are right next to my barn.
Exactly.
And like irrigation is something that, I mean, ideally it doesn't break often, but if you look at what uh, a citrus farm, a cacao farm, and a drier place spends most of their time on, it's fixing irrigation and dealing with irrigation. and it breaks. You need to monitor it. Like you can work out some of the kinks by having a really good system that is the opposite of held together with duct tape, but like you still need to monitor it.
Guys,
So
makes so much
make that
sense when you talk about irrigation because it's such a key part. Even here in South Florida, we get so much rain, but regardless, there's still parts of the year where there is very few rain. So you have to have some sort of irrigation if you don't want to be, watering yourself every day. So it's
because
such
you're
a
in
key
sand.
aspect of it. Oh, for sure. It's sand. And I mean, you could, of course, change how your land is over time. And now you have really good topsoil and all of that. But even then, trees and plants still need regular water if you want them to thrive. So irrigation is so key. And I think it's something that we still need to develop as a whole, because there's so many ways of doing it. But you mentioned there's a lot of maintenance, a lot of parts that can break or need replacement, and it can be very expensive. And it made me sort of just think while you were mentioning it and it probably makes sense. I don't know if you've looked into star forts too much, but how they all star forts, but how they all have channels of water through them, and it's like cities, and that's probably how they irrigate it. So that's probably a whole episode that I'll probably look into later. But anyways, my next question would be on. I read on your website that you create farms built-in models that are for cost, revenues, yield projections, and labor assumptions. So, can you
Yep.
explain how those built-in models work?
Yep, totally. So when you use overyield, which I right now it's way more useful than it is expensive. So it's about $70 a month, but it saves so much time getting you out of spreadsheets and into like a planning process that's more fun and iterative and quick. I'm not trying to advertise it because, like, honestly, we don't make most of our revenue from overyield as a business. Overyield just facilitates everything else that we do. Um, so you log in, you see your farm, you select your growing zone, and then you're going to have these templates pop up. And I think I counted the potential data points that can be in a template, and it's like up to 1,600 or something like that. And a lot of them might be the same data point in terms of like how much time you spend doing a homogenous task over a certain number of years. If it's like 30 seconds per tree per year, or um, $14 per acre per year, or 6 hours per year or per month or something like that. Um, so within those templates, I'll try and describe them. It's easier if you look at them, but you have uh, an operations tab, and that's separated into installation, management, harvest, and marketing. So you basically you have a set of tasks that is pre-filled out for a certain crop, whether that's elderberries or black locust. We also have tropical crops in there, both for Hawaii and for the Dominican Republic. So it's probably using one of those templates would probably translate pretty well to Florida, or the Bahamas, or really anywhere down that way. Puerto Rico. Uh, and then you can say change your labor rate depending on where you are. So Dominican templates versus Hawaii templates, you have this trade-off between like uh, hours spent weeding versus access to machinery to negate those hand hours. Uh, so you have this template, and you have operations, you have capital expenses. So those are like your equipment, your fixed costs. Those are the hardest tabs to fill out and understand because everyone likes to talk about their revenue and the money that's coming in the door before they talk about their costs and the money that's going out the door. For the revenue tab, you have to understand your yields. So, how much of each, say, fruit, nut, timber product you're producing, how much value you're adding to that. So, whether you're selling whole logs or fence posts or boards or raised beds, whatever you want to make, um, picnic tables. You could probably put picnic table production into overyield, but no one's done that yet. And then with berries, if it's whole berries, frozen berries, juice, frozen juice, etc. So you have your different products, and then you have your different prices that you know and have in the system. And once you understand all the things you have to do and all the money you can make and how long it's going to take you to do all those tasks, you basically uh, jar your little square and then populate that with the crops that you want. And with all that data, the software tells you uh, like what your financial returns are and how long it's going to take to do all those tasks.
Hey, did your screen freeze for a second or no?
Oh, no, you're good. I don't
Okay,
think
so
so.
then you probably still kept recording. Just my screen froze for like a good 5 seconds, so we're good. But definitely, man, thank you for sharing that. I think it's so important to have um, those systems in place that help you optimize your your entire production. And I think it's what I'm looking to learn more. So I'm looking forward to understanding overyield a little better. So maybe we could connect for that after this for sure.
Totally.
And another thing that I wanted to ask you was related to grazing animals. Why is tree shade critical for grazing animals?
Yeah. It's more critical the farther south you go or the hotter of a climate you're in. So, tree shade for cattle outside of Quebec City in Canada is not of much interest at all. But in Florida or near the equator, you're almost approaching a system where it makes sense for a beef or dairy or any livestock system to be more and more treed, and maybe even with intensive silvopasture in Colombia to be totally forested. And with the shade, say beef cattle will gain 60% more weight on hot days when they have access to tree shade. So you're balancing digestion, comfort, the willingness of the animal to eat with the amount of forage that's available. So you want a lot of good, palatable food in a place that's really easy to eat. That's the simplest way to describe it.
Very interesting, and just the metrics that you mentioned, because I think it's something that is missing when it comes to the knowledge of growing your own food and actually producing a yield that is not only for consumption, right, of you and your family, but if you want to actually make it a business and be able to live off of it, right? A lot of people have that interest of going back to the land or going back to nature, how you mentioned at the beginning of the call, or they're interested in helping ecology. But then, how do they still uh, provide for their everyday needs with the things that they are doing, right? The things that are growing or the livestock that they're keeping, and knowing those metrics, all the variables, is really what is important. And that's why I mentioned how you described the overyield. It sounds like it's a great tool, which I'm definitely interested in understanding a little bit better. Now, another thing is, again, as we mentioned in the beginning of the call, is the whole concept of today's episode is agroforestry, right? And it's a term that I think is gaining a lot of popularity in the internet and social media. And just wanted to help the audience understand what agroforestry is on a basic level, but also dive into important principles within it. And looking in your website, I saw that you described it as an integration of fruit, nut, and timber trees with animal or crop farming systems. So I was hoping that you could elaborate a little bit on that definition.
Agroforestry means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, depending on where they are in their climate and then what they're most interested in. So you can have multi-strata agroforestry in the tropics, whether that's shade-grown coffee or shade-grown cacao or silvopasture or intensive silvopasture. So intensive silvopasture is usually shade trees with fodder shrubs. So you'll have things like Titonia and Leucaena or Leucaena, and as you go farther north, you'll have mulberry and willow that cattle can eat. So you have these complex systems in the tropics, and the farther north you go, I'll go to the other end of the spectrum. A windbreak might just be the dominant agroforestry practice. So if you go to North Dakota or Patagonia, where you have cold wind and you might even have hot dry wind. So hot dry wind is a huge thing in, say, the fruit growing regions of Patagonia. I think I don't know if it's double, but it's a solid increase in grade A fruit when you protect the crops from wind. Agroforestry could be a lot simpler. So you have those production oriented systems, and then you have the ecological side. So if you look at the language that, say, NGOs or government agencies use in agroforestry, those entities that are tasked with managing public goods. So when I say public goods, think like public health is a public good, military spending, public safety is a public good, and then ecosystem services, so clean water, clean air, et cetera, are also public goods. So agroforestry can be production focused, and it can also be purely environmentally focused, ecologically focused. That, and you can combine those two things, but you can have a riparian buffer, so trees and woody crops next to waterways to decrease phosphorus and nitrogen runoff and decrease the amount of sediment that's in rivers. And that riparian buffer can produce things for a farm. And you'll have one end of the spectrum, the ecology side, that says, okay, agroforestry is native forests, forested buffers, don't touch it. And that's agroforestry. And if you pay farmers to do that, they're more likely to do it. So I think, or if you mandate that practice, which is what Costa Rica does. And if you are existing more in a market economy with fewer subsidies and less public funding, as is the case in the United States, you might want to look towards things like getting timber, so small timber plantations going on the sides of waterways. Because if you have native forest that isn't mandated, that is growing on the side of a waterway, and say a farmer comes along and says, hey, that's 3 acres of production that I'm foregoing because there are trees growing there. I'm paying taxes on that land, or I'm leasing it, I'm paying for it, but I'm not getting any production out of that. You see farmers come along and rip all the trees out with an excavator, put them into a pile, and burn them with diesel fuel. So like approaching this in the red pill way, we have to look at what farmers are more interested in actually managing. I say farmers, that extends to land managers, anyone that's managing land. So planting trees, which people can get an income from, is a really potent way to increase conservation practices. And you can really thread that needle. It's not even threading the needle, it's just increasing the overlap in the Venn diagram between conservation and production.
And on that last part, how small do you think someone can go when it comes to a property and still have that mindset of planting trees and having to making a profit out of it?
You could have so in some places it's called a green belt, which is the space between the sidewalk and the road that has grass on it. You could plant a garden there, you could plant larger trees there, and you could have that tree shading your house and shading your driveway and reducing your energy costs and reducing the heat island effect. So you can shrink that as much as you want. And then you can move that to a large scale, where something that we're doing is we manage about 2,000 acres of chestnut alley cropping, which is where we have chestnut trees all planted in a grid or a key line grid, and we harvest hay from between the trees. So alley cropping is usually the combination of tree crops and herbaceous crops, whether that's corn, soy, wheat, or hay in between rows of trees.
Well, that's very interesting. For sure, a great way for people to still makes a profit and getting all the benefits like the energy savings from the shade. Another aspect that you mentioned, you could do either the production focus, the ecologically or environmentally focused, or combine them both, right? But then how does related to the ecologically and environmentally focused, how can agroforestry decrease the erosion and nutrient loss in a production?
Yeah, there are a few ways to think about this. If you if you think about a baking sheet or a cutting board, and you spray water on it, all the water runs off of it. But say you covered that baking sheet with like bread and sprayed water on it, that would make the bread disgusting. But like, or covered it with sponges or something like that. When you increase the roughness and the texture of a landscape, that holds sediment and nutrients much better. So, say you have a buffer or just any amount of land surface area. Um, you, let's see, with trees, you're going to absorb about 4.5 times more nutrient runoff than you would with just grass. So trees are large and rough, and they're going to slow the rain down as it falls. So the power of raindrops, of falling water, is powerful. It's significant. And trees act like umbrellas. Their roots will pump water down into the ground, and they'll also take water that's in the ground and pump it into the air. So hydraulic lift is a term there. And then all of the duff, all of the branches they put on the ground, that would be more in a conservation oriented system. Those just catch sediment. So yeah, trees and rough landscapes, ideally that humans can interact with as well, are a great agroforestry practice component, that not just catches sediment before it goes into the water, but if you plant trees, specific species along a water course, their roots will actually reach into the water and pull out nitrogen and phosphorus that are already in the water. So you're not just stopping the honestly pollutants or sediment that's running off your farm, but you can also capture stuff from other farms or parking lots.
Yeah, the nutrients. So
Yep.
fertilize as well. You
Yep.
mentioned earlier, you mentioned a little bit about it on silvopasture, right? So I was wondering, how does silvopasture integrate the trees, forage, and grazing livestock into the same land?
Yep. Silvopasture is phenomenal. Uh, it 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 has different appearances. Silvopasture looks differently depending on where you are, and people have different understandings of what silvopasture is. Um, I'll highlight the main two right now. They actually have different terms for them. So let's see, in English, it's silvopasture by addition, so planting trees in pasture, and then silvopasture by incorporation or subtraction, which is thinning existing forest enough to let the light go through the canopy and grow grass underneath, and then creating shade paddocks and food production from an existing forest. In Argentina, they call planting trees on grazing lands sistemas silvopastoriles, silvopasture systems, or another one is silvopastoreo. And then the thinning forests for livestock, I think it's manejo del bosque con ganadería integrada, which is forest management with livestock integration. So they're two different terms, two different practices, really two different practices that get lumped into one thing in English, which is silvopasture. And let's see, say you're in the north of the US and you have 100 acres, you have a dairy operation, and you have like some scrub land, and it has short trees. You're not really getting anything out of it. And there you have a bunch of like buckthorn, honeysuckle, multiflora rose, privet, name your quote invasive shrubs. And you need some shade paddocks at the same time, because say you have 10 hot days per year and you want to go use that land as a shade paddock. And you also have some they could be great trees, they could be like B or C grade trees growing. You can go in with, say, a forestry mulcher, which is basically a skid steer, a bobcat with a wood chipper on the front, and you can just mow down those shrubs. And then you could seed it at the same time. Then you could use your cattle at a high stocking density to stamp in the seed, and then you have grass growing underneath trees. So that would be an example of silvopasture by subtraction. Silvopasture by addition looks like planting trees in pastures. There are a bunch of different ways to do that. So the most logistically simple way to do that, seemingly, is so taking call it one paddock or one field, call it 10 acres, if that's one paddock for you, and depending on how big your herd size is. And then you plant. So the faster the trees grow, the sooner you're going to be able to incorporate the livestock into that paddock. But you can plant trees and then hay between those trees until the trees are big enough to incorporate livestock into that paddock. So that might be, say, 3 inches DBH, baseball bat width. It can be smaller in the short term. You can also have you can also use tree guards that have electric wire connected to the tree guards to keep the animals off the trees, depending on really your opportunity cost of pasture and how much you hay. So another way to create silvopasture that we've looked at is using effectively a windbreak, a thick windbreak, a multi-row windbreak as a paddock. So if wind protection is something you need, then planting a few rows of trees and having it maybe be 60 to 100 feet wide, that's a really narrow paddock, but you're probably going to fence it off anyway. And if you fenced it off, you can make it a bit wider and then have a long, thin shade paddock. So lots of different ways to do silvopasture. Happy to dive into anything specific that would be helpful.
Definitely. Just like any concept, you could dive into the specifics and make an entire episode on any of those subjects, right? You mentioned, can you repeat the description of silvopasture in Spanish that said something related to manejo de? You said manejo de?
Manejo, manejo del bosque con ganadería integrada. So,
Okay, okay. So that's like
yeah,
managing of the forest with livestock, integrating livestock, basically.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Managing the
I,
forest, integrating livestock. Okay, that sounds good.
yeah, and it's a mouthful. And they have an acronym which is MBGI, MBGI, and I like the no one says this, but the closest translation I've been able to come up with is forest livestock integration, or like flint, because it's like a type of rock. Like people know the word flint, but no one says flint. So if we want to start promoting that today, I'm happy to jump on board with that.
Well, you said Flint,
Yeah, no, like no one says that, but it's a cool
so that would
acronym.
be what? That would be forest.
Livestock integration.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's very interesting because when you started describing the different types of silvopasture, you mentioned by addition, by subtraction, right? Then you said something related to systems. I wrote it down. And then obviously now we translate it from Spanish to English and we come up with management of forest, integrating livestock. And obviously,
Yep.
integrating is another mathematical term, right? Integration. So it's very interesting how we have terms that
Yep.
are related to mathematics. Earlier, you were giving us some variables when it comes to being profitable. Also, is involving the sciences and mathematics, right? And I think it's something that we need to bridge to the general population, right? Because a lot of people are interested in growing their own food, either for health wise or the freshness, etc. So it's very interesting how we have terms that are related to mathematics, so if we could integrate or have the mathematical aspects, the scientific aspects into it, is going to help even the small scale homesteads, farmers, people that are just doing it as a hobby, is going to help them to be even more productive and improve their yields. So very interesting when it comes to civil pasture. Another question that I was hoping that you could explain is, why are trees essential for protecting water quality?
Yep. Yep. So if we think about poor water quality, there are different recurring themes. Um, there's a dead zone about the size of Rhode Island, where the Mississippi meets the Gulf of Mexico. So where there aren't any fish. And that's because of the agricultural runoff from upstream in the Mississippi watershed. On a smaller scale, so that that affects the ecology of the region, sure. And like how much seafood are we foregoing in that what in that space that would otherwise be a thriving estuary with, say, shrimp and other fish, um, from, I guess, just a human centric perspective. Um, on a smaller scale, if you leave a clear tank out of water, and it gets hot and there's some carbon or phosphorus in there, you get algae growth. And the same thing happens in streams, creeks, ponds, lakes. So you get these things called harmful algal blooms, which is cyanobacteria, algae, effectively, that grows with warm water and nitrogen and phosphorus. And they can actually be toxic. So, say if you have a dog that doesn't know that there's an algal bloom there and jumps into the water, the dog can actually poison itself from jumping into that water. I mean, same thing happens with people too, but it more often happens with dogs. Um, and I mean, you can have a dead zone in a lake. It can, I'm sure you've seen this in Florida. You can close the beaches due to algae. That's no fun. Um, so, like, water, I mean, growing food is important for society. Like, famine is not fun. That's an understatement. But, like, quality of life and quality of ecosystems is also really important. So but it's at the same time, it's this collective problem in society because the benefits are privatized from excuse me, um, from growing food to a large extent, because farmers grow food, make money, and the costs are often pushed on to the public. And that's not a statement that's blaming farmers. That's just kind of a statement of fact. In that, say the NRCS and other agencies are cleanup agencies, and they're tasked with cleaning up all of the agricultural pollution that exists. So you have this conundrum of, I mean, other countries treat it differently. Uh, in say the European Union, farming is much more of a public endeavor. Say the first question when you talk about agroforestry in the EU, the first question you get is how does it affect the subsidies, the cap subsidies, and that's different in the U.S. So yeah, you have this agroforestry is a it synchronizes not synchronizes, but it is affected by and has to do with both private goods, market goods, so things that you buy and sell, and public goods, which are usually the domain of the public sector, the government.
Yeah, very interesting because I think that's where knowledge and education is so key because the past few generations, there's been a disconnect between where our food grows and coming to our plate, right? We eating it. So because we don't have that knowledge, and I'm speaking for myself, right? Because I really just started growing or being interested in growing my own food maybe the last 5 years, right? Maybe 6 years now. But that's small amount of my entire life, right? So knowledge is that first step. We have to get the majority of the people to start learning all these concepts because it affects not just as a homestead or I want to help the environment or maybe I do it as a hobby, but in reality it touches every point of society, right? Because we have to eat every single day, every person, right? And how you mentioned famine is such a horrible thing, and it is a real thing that is still happening to this day. When
Yep.
the technology and the resources, it shouldn't be happening, right? So I think knowledge and education is the first step, right? Because getting into how all the different places of the world do things is so hard, right? Because it varies very greatly from one place to another. But the one thing that we can um, all do right now is at least gain that knowledge, gain the education, and then implementing it ourselves. And from there, we could see how we could then help the community and larger areas, right? Um, Another thing that you mentioned is just that the question was on the quality of the water, and that influences, of course, the quality of life as a whole of the ecosystems. And it just made me think how obviously we are mainly made out of water, right? Like the human body, and even the world as a whole, how much water there is compared to land. So it just goes to show again how different things relate to each other. We're talking about growing food, but then water is so important to the whole food production system, and water is so important to us as a organism, and even the world as a whole. So again, knowledge and education is so important, and wisdom and understanding even more. Um, but now I just wanted to sort of end the conversation with a mindset question, really, because obviously we all want to grow our own food and get closer to that source of where we get our nutrition from. But at the same time, it does take a lot of effort, a lot of discipline. Is you're gonna make a lot of mistakes, just like anything in life or any new endeavor that you're taking. So I was just hoping to see, how you could give the audience some mindset advice on discipline, effort, right? Staying consistent. And
Yeah.
how does your, I saw on your Instagram that you were part of Team USA pentathlete, and I have a hard
Yeah.
time saying that word. But how
It's
does
okay.
your Team USA experience discipline transfer into agroforestry and farming?
Yeah. I think the first, so kind of a two-part question there. I'll try and weave in uh, how you can get involved with how I've seen food play a role in my life. I think the most important thing is at the onset of, say, a journey, a foray into being involved in food systems, is to pick something that you really like and that you're interested in, and just try it out, whether that's composting or having chickens or planting a garden or planting a green belt or getting involved with a small organization in your community that's planting trees. Um, there's so many ways to plug in, and you don't have to do everything all at once. And say you have kids and you have less time than you did when you were 18 or something like that, and like maybe gardening with kids or something like that is something that you're passionate about, and that's that's a phenomenal thing to do. I grew up at a summer camp, so outdoor recreation and education is kind of just baked into who I am as a person. um, so pentathlon, modern pentathlon is an Olympic sport that it's hard to, in the past it's been hard to screen and watch on the television, so it's not as common as say watching swimming or gymnastics. But the five sports are running, swimming, horseback riding, fencing, and pistol shooting. They actually recently substituted out horseback riding for obstacle course racing, so kind of like Ninja Warrior, to make the sport more accessible to countries that don't have horses or don't have a lot of access to equestrian sports, because riding horses is ungodly expensive. Um, so after undergrad, after college, I trained for 2 years as a resident athlete at the Colorado Springs Olympic Training Center, and we had 20 to 25 practices per week. I was eating estimated up to say 5,000 calories a day. I remember one day I had a 6 egg omelet for breakfast and then had a 5 egg omelet for breakfast, for second breakfast, like not that much time afterwards. Um, so the quantity of food that we would eat was pretty significant. And when you're burning all of these different types of food, you get a really nuanced perspective into how different carbohydrates, fat, and protein affect like your, not just your physical performance but your mental performance, because your throughput of food is just, it's much higher than it would be for someone who isn't moving to that excessive amount. And you notice the quality as well. So when food is lower in nutrient density, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, etc., you have to eat more of it to get the same effect and the same response. So, an extreme example, when you're eating empty calories, you're not going to feel satiated. When you're eating super nutrient dense, say, meat, dairy, fruit, vegetables, carbohydrates, so starches, etc., you your plate looks smaller because you have a higher quality of food. Um, and like foods that come from thriving ecosystems pack a much bigger punch than a lot of conventional foods that come from an industrial farming system. And as a nation, as a globe, we have like I think we produced enough calories in the year 2000 to feed 8 billion people, and I don't think we have 8 billion people on the planet yet. I think we now produce enough calories to feed about 10 billion people, and we're not seeing famine anymore as a result of lack of food. Hunger and famine and starvation are almost always politically driven at this point in time, whether that's via corrupt governments or war. That's usually how hunger occurs. And you still have hunger in the U.S. in poorer, lower income communities, but it's drastically less than it was, say, even 20 years ago. Um, we're now seeing diseases of not of hunger, but of malnutrition, uh, diabetes. This is not a judgment. It's just like what is actually occurring: diabetes, obesity, heart disease, all these things that don't come from a lack of calories, but come from a surplus of calories and a deficit of vitamins, minerals, amino acids, like real nutrition. So I think, not I think, like demonstratively getting involved in where your food comes from, it gets you moving, it gets you outside, going to a farmer's market, talking to all the vendors, like just asking questions uh, about how they produce food. And you can ask easy questions, like open-ended questions, like, and then you can go home and research something about that production method if that's of interest to you. Or the number of ways to get involved in food um, is large, and you can always find something that you actually want to do. And if you're doing something that you like, you're going to do more of it, and then you can tack on tangential things to that. So with me, it was always trees because I like forests, and it was food because I like eating, and from there arose agroforestry. So life is good.
Man, such a great answer. And you hit on so many points that we could go on talking about this forever. And but it made me think of, obviously, when you're training to be an athlete, you have so much more activity. So you mentioned the amount of more food that you need is incredible, right? Like we can't really understand it until you're in that position. But then it made me think that a lot of people get into growing their own food for the prepping aspect, like, oh, the world, something's going to happen, an emergency, and I need to have my homestead and growing my own food. Is similar to an athlete, right? Because in those sort of situations, let's say an emergency, you're going to be using so much more energy, right? Let's say it's a natural disaster, and now you're going to have to cut the trees that fell down using a chainsaw, or let's say you don't have any gas and you're using an axe. How much more energy you're going to be spending those days of those emergencies, let's say. So how much more food you're going to need in those cases. But then you mentioned that the type of food is so key, because it's not so much just about eating more, is the quality of the food and the level of nutrition within it. So then that's where growing our own food and learning how to grow it and that it is actually nutritious is so important. So yeah, I mean, and I agree with you that it's not that famine is no longer lack of food. It's really just the systems in place are either purposely driving the famine, or they're just not efficient or optimized, right? It's, I think there's cases of both, right? Some, obviously, one of them is not good intentions, the other one is just lack of planning and organization. One of them we can't really impact that much, but the other one, when it comes to improving the systems and optimizing them, definitely we could improve that even on an individual level, on a family community level, and then that would impact larger, um, you know, communities. So I think it's really just about putting in the work ourselves, because we can't dwell on the things that we can't change. So we could gain the knowledge, get educated. reach out to those people that do know, like how you mentioned earlier, in the call benchmark what others are doing, right? And learning from people. That is such a key thing. It's not seeing the other people that grow foods different ways or do other type of farming or agricultural practices just as a competition and as an enemy. But in reality, how can I learn from what you're doing over there in Massachusetts, or let's say, for example, the software over yield that you are using? How can I implement that here in Florida, right? Instead of seeing it as a, oh, how could I beat him or anything. No, it's how could we work together, how could we learn from each other, because there's something that we could all help each other somehow. um, so I appreciate that, man. And just lastly, if you want to, for the people listening, how could they find you on the social media, and if they want to get in contact with you, or if you have any events that you would like to invite people to?
Awesome. So, and honestly, thanks so much for taking the time and having me on. This has been a really fantastic conversation. If you want to find out more and learn more, propagateag.com is our website. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. My personal Instagram that you referenced is underscore Harry underscore Greene. I'm pretty easy to find. And let's see, events. This summer, we'll probably host a farm planning for agroforestry event. We did that last year. Also thinking about a food forest workshop that might be with Propagate or just on my farm. So look out for that. And then, yeah, there are going to be other conferences that we're going to. And yeah, if you just, yeah, keep up, you'll see where we are and how you can plug in.
Awesome, man. I would love to have you back into the show at a later time. And at that time, it will be more to dive more, deeper into probably a specific topic related that we discussed today, more maybe technical for those that are interested to actually, put into implementation on their life. So I appreciate you joining, man. And I hope everyone had a great time listening to this. Thank you.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Andres.